Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first concurrent session of the day, Critical Thinking in the Classroom. Our presenter today is Lori Daniels, a faculty member at Kaiser University. If you have any questions for the presenter during the session, please feel free to enter those into our Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom room screen, and we'll address them at the end of the talk. On that note, I will hand it over to our presenter.
Hello. I'm seeing if I can get this to work. Oh, there I am. I popped up there. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's try this. There we go. All right. And there's too many buttons. So sorry. I'm very close. Where is it? Give me a second here. Okay. So you can see there's a lot of things on the screen. So whoops, the wrong one. And I can't see there. Oh, trying to get into. There we go. Okay, that should be working. It should look good. All right, so thank you for the introduction. Like the moderator said, my name is Dr. Daniels, and my presentation today is going to be on critical thinking in the classroom. Now that I have it set up. Okay, there we go. All right, so I figured when we start, we should talk about the concept of, idea of, or definition of what critical thinking is. And there is, of course, more than one definition out there, like for many concepts, though in theory, they should all kind of agree or have similarities. So I chose 3 here to kind of look at to see, what they have in common or what they're all emphasizing. And as you can see, with most of the definitions that I chose, there's this idea for critical thinking being systematic, that is orderly, purposeful, and an actual skill that people would develop in a particular way with sort of an emphasis on trying to improve their thinking. Another way of looking at it then is more specifically, some definitions cover the idea of evaluating and analyzing ideas or evidence, arguments, and again, in this sort of systematic way, or claims and arguments for an end goal to form well-reasoned judgments and decisions. So one of the reasons I wanted to set us up with some definitions in the first place is there's critical thinking is a very almost like buzzword now, right? And so often it is used to really encompass things that probably wouldn't fall under critical thinking. So I've heard, if anyone kind of does something, just common mistakes people might make, they might be called not a critical thinker for that, right? But that's not really what critical thinking is. It doesn't mean people can't make mistakes or kind of temporarily forget something. So it is more strategic in the definition of an attempt to analyze and evaluate information with ultimately a goal of improving thoughts overall and thinking styles overall. So it is more of a process than you forgot something, so you're not a critical thinker anymore type idea. Also, then, because it is a process or an attempt to think in ways where we analyze and evaluate information, it is going to include what's considered a range of skills. That is, there are many different ways, some of which I'll talk about today, that we can encourage in the classroom, but also, and in many ways just as important, actual dispositions or ways of thinking or attempting to think that really characterize what critical thinking is all about. As you can see, that then includes also the ability to recognize bias and prejudice in our thinking, evaluate evidence, consider alternative viewpoints, and then essentially draw logical conclusions. There we go. Okay, so now we looked at what critical thinking is, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about that. I think it's always worth asking, well, why bother, right? What are the actual benefits of critical thinking? So there's a wide range of potential benefits from critical thinking in everyday life, and particularly for students, since that's the topic in general here, it would be anything from improving problem solving, that is increasing the ability to look at things from other angles and therefore perhaps solve problems that they may not have been able to solve before. Additionally, increases in ability to make decisions by evaluating pros and cons, evaluating evidence, the reliability and the credibility of evidence that's presented or that they find in order to make those decisions. So all around, you could get an improvement in decision making by using critical thinking skills. Also, communication, the ability to express clearly what your arguments or your goals are, and to understand them in others as well. Again, improve communication. Innovation is on here because one of the things, and I think sometimes it's underlooked in critical thinking, is that one of our definitions really emphasize it, which is the idea of a goal of improvement. And an improvement, or looking at things in new ways, can lead to innovation or sort of increases in creative ways of viewing information. Critical thinking also has many elements that challenge what might be considered a status quo, and because of that can also lead to innovation. And then ultimately, critical thinking can improve personal growth as well, as individuals examine their own prejudice and bias, ways of thinking, things that are sort of ways of thinking that are holding them back. So there's a wide range of potential benefits for really anyone to be a critical thinker. Okay, so first I wanted to examine what are called intellectual traits, and these would be the disposition portion of critical thinking. And the disposition or trait idea is similar to traits as we view them in sort of personality, right? A sort of a frequency or way of being, an attempt to continually be or think, in this case, in a certain way. So the word trait is being used to indicate a frequency, not an all or none, but an attempt to really act, think, and behave in a certain way. Now, because they're intellectual traits, the realm is really in the thinking, though the idea would be that it would likely spill over into how people, perhaps how people act as well. But predominantly, this is based on thinking styles or traits in thinking. And so part of being a critical thinker then would definitely require practice, awareness of the traits, practice of them as a form of sort of continuous, right? Again, maybe not in necessarily an all or none. So we're going to look at some of these traits. I have them listed there, but we're going to go into a little more detail. So here we go. Okay, so some of these traits, for instance, like so you'll recognize them, but they involve styles of thinking or ways of thinking. So for instance, intellectual humility, the idea that one becomes aware of what they know and don't know, and so begins to question what they really know. Also makes distinctions between what we might consider superficial learning, sort of is kind of a little bit of knowledge of something, versus a deeper learning or a deeper understanding, and the ability to recognize the difference as well, right? So questions like self-reflective questions like, what do I really know about myself, about others, about the world? How much do prejudice and bias influence my thinking? How much have I been indoctrinated into the beliefs I have that may be false? And how much do I uncritically accept things as they are? So a lot of these traits, looking at humility, indicates an awareness of the self to really question what they know and what they don't know. And again, this would be pretty much on a daily basis. It's not just once, but kind of a constant thinking about it. Intellectual courage, the disposition to question beliefs you feel strongly about. The idea here is that it's usually pretty easy to question beliefs you don't feel strongly about, in the sense maybe you don't really care that much. So this is really about taking the things that matter the most to you, or that you identify with the most, and questioning them to make sure that what you're building your thinking and your identity around is solid, that you understand it in a sense, right? So, how much have I analyzed my beliefs, that many of which are learned from childhood? Would I be willing to give up a belief if there's sufficient evidence against it? And how much am I willing to go against others, to stand up for beliefs I thought through, even if that has negative consequences for me? We also have intellectual empathy. This is a big one. I think one that we try to get a lot of practice in an academic environment. And there's going to be a lot of techniques I'll talk about to help increase or bring awareness to intellectual empathy. So this is really the need to entertain views that are different from your own, particularly if you disagree with them, right? Again, if you agree with them, it's not hard to do that. So this again is about the more difficult aspect. And then also to accurately summarize viewpoints that you disagree with. So to really think about what the opposite side views, and to give them a fair actual shake, rather than sort of a straw man argument, or things like that, to reduce their argument, but instead to view it for what it is. Also, we have intellectual integrity, holding yourself to the same intellectual standards as others. So if you value logic as a form of debates, do you expect that from others, and do you yourself use that as well when you argue or communicate in some way? So it's really looking at contradictions, asking those types of questions. Do I really utilize the same thing I expect others to do as well? The last three here, some of which you'll see that show up a lot in a academic environment. So for instance, intellectual perseverance. This is kind of another way of talking about productive struggle. So the idea of working through complexities. The heart of this, of course, is that critical thinking is not necessarily, many types of thinking are not necessarily easy, and therefore do require continual practice, and may also lead to frustrations. And so the ability to work through those frustrations when things get tough, and also having particular strategies for dealing with complex problems as well. Confidence in reason. Here, this is based on the belief that the best interests of humankind are served by giving the freest play to reason. So what that really means is that the form of argumentation, debate, and thought should be with reason being the reason and logic being the ultimate deciders, right? As in this is, of course, as opposed to, say, emotion or simply ego, right? Like, oh, I want to believe something, therefore I will. Instead, arguing that the reasoning should be what wins the day. And so some of our questions here is, willingness to change positions if the evidence leads to actually a more reasonable position, even if that's not a very comfortable feeling, or it goes against maybe things that previously you believed. And again, with talking with others, do you use that same reasoning to persuade or argue instead of distorting matters? And then the last one is intellectual autonomy, thinking for yourself. This again is kind of an anti-conformity type one, or another way of looking at it is, not just simply accepting the things simply because someone else said it, right? Uncritically accepting the viewpoints of others, but to think for yourself in a sense, and trust yourself to be able to do it. So the reason I brought up the intellectual traits is because, as you can see, in critical thinking, it's not just what people do, but also their attempts, their ways of thinking, what kind of traits they want to have, right? And so these are examples of the types of traits that a critical thinker would want to live up to. And again, certainly there's times and days where they would not be able to. It's not all or none, but this is like the striving for. Okay. All right, so now we're going to look at some techniques to encourage critical thinking in the classroom. Okay, so we'll go into some detail about these, but I wanted to kind of give an overview first. We have Socratic questioning, which we'll look at, collaborative learning, inquiry-based learning, role-playing, and reflection are the examples I'm going to use. This is not all of them, of course, but I think it gives you enough idea of ways to take these self-reflective properties and put them into the classroom. So the first one we're going to look at is Socratic thinking. And Socratic thinking is really a method. And here I have that ask students, though it could be ask anybody, of course, but ask students thought-provoking questions to really help them clarify their thinking and ideas. Socratic questioning then goes back to Socrates, who was very famous for, and perhaps annoying for doing this. And in the sense that people would come to him with potential problems or issues or things, and instead of giving them the quote unquote answer, which they weren't really factual questions anyway that one would have an answer for, but had them sort of come up with how they think about it themselves by asking them questions that would provoke self-reflection and thoughts and what underlies the questions they're asking. So questions like, on what do you base your beliefs? If you say this is true, wouldn't this be true as well? Kind of connecting and having elaboration. Can you elaborate this on this? And if it's complex questions, what other questions lead up to this? So this is just some examples. I'll give you a few more as we go through. One of the things that's great about Socratic questioning is that it can be applied pretty easily in many ways. So for instance, in a kind of a lecture style format where questions are being thrown out, someone answers, certainly this could, be done that way, or even a way of presenting the, certain material where essentially you could lead students through a Socratic questioning methods as well. Okay. So one thing they have here is what we call the components of thought. And so the components of thought, or elements of thinking, is really the idea that whenever we think, that there are certain elements that are present. And so if we take these elements that are present, we could break down and ask, in this case, Socratic questions about them. So for instance, anytime we think there's a purpose, whether it's stated or not, and often it may not be stated, so that's a particular Socratic type question one could ask, which is, what is the purpose of what we're doing? What is the purpose of your question? Or response or answer. There's also an embedded question, even if thought is not necessarily in the form of a question, there's always a particular question at issue. Understanding what that question is, again, is not always obvious. So one might have to think, well, this is really a question of blank, right? That's the type of idea here. We also, in all thinking, use concepts in our interpretation of what concepts are, what they mean, can be a little slippery slope. So the idea here is to pull out the concepts we're using, how we're using them, and to understand that. We also make assumptions to form our interpretations. We're going to look at that in a moment. But we also have information, so we can talk about the information we have and whether it's reliable or credible. That leads to implications, and essentially all thinking is done through a particular point of view. So if we look at these, and I'll show you in a moment with some of these, how we can then turn that into Socratic questioning. Again, if all thinking contains these elements, then any of these questions would be appropriate whenever someone's thinking. Okay. So inferences and assumptions, I chose this one out of the list because they're rather big, and it's things I think pop up a lot. And so as far as Socratic questioning or any type of reflective questioning, asking what kind of assumption that somebody or yourself is making is very useful for critical thinking, because the most part, and there are some exceptions to this, but for the most part, assumptions occur unconsciously. So they're just things that over time we've learned to kind of expect, and therefore we may not even be aware we're operating under these assumptions, and we may not even question them. So critical thinking asks us to become more aware and to question our assumptions to see if they're accurate, if they're assumptions we want to keep, or if not. And the important part of these assumptions is that they essentially will lead to our conclusions. So different assumptions lead to different conclusions, our inferences. So if we don't know what our assumptions are, we may not understand how we came to conclusions, or we might be misguided about how we came to conclusions if we don't understand the underlying assumptions. So many forms of Socratic questioning really push at assumptions. What must you be assuming in order to come to this conclusion? To kind of bring the unconscious, or not often thought about, into light, so that it can be thought about. Sense. Also, implication is a big one in Socratic questioning methods. Again, a distinction between what a statement or situation implies and what might be actually inferred from it. And also the idea that there are often different types of implications. So as the idea of implications that are possible, implications that are probable, and implications that are inevitable. So depending on the situation, there may be inevitable implications, or they may just simply be possible. Knowing the difference, or examining the difference between them, can definitely lead to people taking different actions or thinking about things in different ways. So becoming more aware of implications through Socratic questioning can be very helpful, very useful for students. Okay. So another technique along with Socratic questioning that can be used, I did want to say, sorry, before I forget it. So I pretty much put the professor in terms of the person who's being the Socratic questioner to the students, and that is a very common way of doing it, and so there's nothing wrong with that. However, it's not really limited to that. Students can very well Socratically question themselves, right? If they have enough guidelines about questioning their own assumptions, even if someone's not directly prompting them in the moment, that could be something that they reflect on anyway in an assignment because they're asked to, or they can Socratically question each other. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the professor. It's just really any time of questions that probe at those elements of thoughts. Okay. All right, so role-playing as another method of increasing critical thinking is a form of learning in which individuals act out very specific scenarios or situations. And so essentially, kind of a general concept, but the idea is that it's going to encourage different perspective taking by placing students in these various roles. And these roles can often be adopted to the subject matter at hand. So, taking the role of a mathematician, if it's a math class, or things like that. I'll show you some examples in a moment. But the idea is that through role playing, the perspective or point of view they're taking is one that they almost have to adopt in order to successfully do role playing. And therefore, it very much encourages considering the point of view they're taking, not only just for the role playing, but point of view they take in other areas of their life as well. So just to get an idea of thinking through points of view, I have my my boat ship there, the picture there, right? So highlights well, perspective taking, being excited to see the boat when you're stranded on the island, and being excited to see the island when you're stranded on the boat, right? So it's a kind of a very straightforward difference in perspective taking. But the idea is our thinking is highly influenced by the point of view, or point of views, plural, that we're taking, and that we often may not notice the point of views that we're taking when we're thinking through problems. So for instance, we're influenced by the time we live in, right? And so exploring ways of viewing how time generation, right, impacts our thinking, makes us become more aware of it, right? We could be influenced by things such as religion, gender, or sexual orientation. Like I said, various disciplines take different perspectives or in an emotional state, even an age group. This is not an exhaustive list, of course. There are definitely many points of views or perspectives one can take when thinking, and sometimes multiple, like I said, at the same time. So role playing allows students really to put them in that certain perspective, one they may not be familiar with, or they may not have a lot of experience with. And so sort of encouraging them to see things, see the world, see the problem at hand through a different lens, which then ideas can increase critical thinking overall when it's practiced in many different situations. Okay. Another method, critical thinking that can be done in the classroom is what we call inquiry-based learning. And I think in many ways, professors do attempt some version of this, right? So it's kind of general, but it's basically encouraging students to ask questions and then seek out their own answers through investigation or research. And again, it's kind of instead of giving, right, handing out answers, the student becomes more active in finding out those. Students also become more active in asking the right types of questions in the first place. So that's also very important. Again, going back to Socratic questioning, some of these overlap, right? There are questions when asked that will lead to more information than others, or questions that really may be subjective or opinion-based and not as complex or require a sort of pro-con or critical thinking at all. The idea here is that questions that would have perhaps one right answer don't really require critical thinking. Neither do those that are subjective. So what's your favorite type of ice cream? Doesn't require much critical thinking, right? It's just whatever you want it to be or whatever tastes best. So we're talking more complex questions that one could have a different viewpoint on and not necessarily be right or wrong, but really be looking at how well the question is reasoned, the purpose of the question, the function of it, and what kind of answers one would get by asking a more complex questions. So these are more debatable type questions. Should capital punishment be legal? Yes or no, right? That's going to be a question that's going to require more critical thinking than simply, what's your favorite type of ice cream? So I have had a lot of experience in the classroom kind of trying to take those subjective questions and showing why they're subjective, but which often does sometimes lead to critical thinking as well. If you try to make it, a pros cons, so there's some potential there. But it's really the idea that having students ask better questions to get better information that they're looking for. So inquiry-based learning can really help with that. All right, we also have collaborative learning, which is a type of learning done in groups. Right. And the purpose here of having group learning is to do a lot of the things that are kind of already looking at, which is to share perspectives, points of view that students may not even ever thought of because they weren't ever exposed to them. They can be exposed through group or collaborative learning. Also the idea of, challenging ideas, asking questions. But these types of questions can be ones of discipline specific nature. So asking, working on or asking questions from a scientific lens, or what kind of questions would a mathematician be interested in and want to ask. So a lot of these can be done strictly through discipline if that feels more appropriate for the classroom. All right, and then the last technique we'll look at is reflection. In fact, in many ways, all of these have reflection, right? And in fact, reflection is kind of at the heart of critical thinking because it does require one to reflect on their thinking. So just kind of some additional ways that reflection can be done in the classroom, having students break problems down, looking at the elements of thinking, such as purpose, right? We were talking about earlier, what kind of question is inherent in this? What concepts are you using to approach this problem? So the more the students are asked specifically what they're doing, what they're thinking about when they approach something, the more likely it's going to encourage them to critically think, if done in a way where they're asked about the right, about the assumptions, about the interpretations they're making, and what alternative interpretations they could make. Those kind of reflection questions. Some of this, like I said, could be done kind of in vivo, in real life, but also in the moment, but also taken home, reflected upon, brought back, those types of things. And also, the evaluate part of critical thinking is really linked to the idea of intellectual standards. That is, you can't evaluate something unless you know what you're comparing it to, right? A standard or a norm that you're comparing it to. So intellectual standards give us those norms in order to compare, and the idea that thoughts, thinking, communication should be clear, should be accurate, should be precise, relevant, should have depth, breadth, logic, fairness, and significance. So these are ideas of what one could use to say, how am I doing with my thinking, right? Is my thinking clear, or is my communication clear? Is my writing clear? However, it's being assessed, but essentially these are things that could bring awareness to and have students actively reflect on, even maybe, I want to say self-grade, but in a sense, kind of self-grade. Was I being clear? How could I be clearer? Was this logical, where not? It's important in the long run, again, for the intellectual autonomy, that everyone is able to do this themselves. And so there has to be a little bit of give and take between having a professor, tell them, yeah, this isn't very clear, but at some point we want them to be able to see for themselves that it's not clear as well, so that they can improve their own clarity or accuracy or precision. I'm checking my time here. Okay, doing good on time. Okay, all right, so perfect timing. So we have some questions if you want. Come to a conclusion here. Ultimately, I kind of said this, that really self-reflection, the idea of reflecting on intellectual standards, reflecting on the elements of thought, what kind of assumptions am I making, that is really going to be crucial in encouraging critical thinking. And it really should be something that's done on a daily basis and involves a wide variety of topics or problems. So definitely discipline type problems, but also personal problems, personal issues as well. If they can be tied in, are also extremely beneficial, because that's often where the strong beliefs are. That's often where the assumptions, stronger assumptions that are unconscious might be. And so it's kind of a across the board in all thinking to have this self-reflection. And so these self-reflective methods, like I said, really encourage students to assess and evaluate their thinking. So thank you very much. I'd be willing to take any questions or comments.
Thank you, Lori. If you all have any questions, please send them through the chat below. Additionally, Lori, we did get a question from an instructor. She just wanted to know if she would be able to have the PowerPoint presentation after the presentation. Is that something you'll be willing to share with us?
Sure, yeah.
All right, thank you. And everyone, if you have any questions, feel free to send those in through the Q&A now.
Oops, that's me. I'm still sharing my screen, so I don't know if I need to, but I'll just keep it for now, just in case.
All right. If we don't have any other questions,
I see some showing up. Yeah, my screen just, I can't quite read them. I just see numbers.
Okay. If you have questions, you can send them through the Q&A area at the bottom of your Zoom room. We do have some feedback. We had an attendee say that this is really helpful.
Good, good.
All right. So it looks like we have no further questions.
Okay.
Thank you, Lori, for.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for sharing this information with us today. The next concurrent session will begin at 1 p.m. Eastern. You can view the chat for session meeting room links or access the conference website for a complete list of concurrent sessions and their descriptions. While accessing the conference website, don't forget to swing by the virtual exhibit hall to say hello to the Hawks team. While there, you can view a quick 5-minute presentation, request your t-shirt, and be entered to win a $50 hourly giveaway. Also, in the spirit of St. Patrick's Day, you'll find a few golden coins throughout the conference website. Click on the coins to be entered to win an additional raffle. We will see you at the next session.